Hi, so I want to talk today about an issue that's been troubling me probably for a little over the past year now. I made some slides, and the title of my presentation is Science is Science, right? So why is climate change a partisan issue? And if it was just a few people that thought this was a partisan issue, it wouldn't be a big deal to me. The problem that I see is when you have a large fraction of the electorate that sees this as a political issue, it prevents any action from being done. And when you have senators that bring snowballs into Congress and use those as evidence that man-made global warming isn't real, that's kind of troubling to me. So I want to investigate what's really going on here. Okay, so I just want to formally state the question here. And unless you zoned out on my title slide, you probably know the answer. So, which variable is most strongly correlated with one's conviction of anthropogenic, abrupt global climate change? I wanted to be very specific when I was describing these terms. So anthropogenic, of course, means that it's man-made. Abrupt, I'm talking about on geological timescales. And global means that it's happening everywhere on Earth. So is it intelligence, scientific literacy, or political ideology? And of course, the answer is political ideology. You don't have to go too far to find intelligent, scientifically literate people. There's even climate scientists that go against what most of the other climate scientists are telling us. They're obviously intelligent and scientifically literate. But political ideology, this really didn't fit with the way that I saw the world, so I was kind of confused. But if you do a little digging, you find this isn't the first time this has happened. There are other scientific issues where people choose not to believe them for whatever reason. A couple examples would be evolution, vaccines. I think a really great example is that of the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson. He did some work with ants that implied that there were gender and race differences, and most of his liberal peers had a really tough time accepting this at first. So I think the difference here is that climate change is a very serious issue. We have a limited time window before really, I guess in my opinion, bad things are going to start to happen. And we've got the solutions right in front of us. All we have to do is accept that there's a problem and get to work fixing it. Okay, so this is the way it is. I guess we should just accept that and move on and try to explain it. So what I'm showing here on the bottom is this is the level of concern of climate change. And on the left you have alarmed. As you move to the right, you have the concerned, the cautious, the disengaged, the doubtful, and finally the dismissive are the people that don't want to accept climate change at all. This data comes from the Yale Project Climate Change Communications. What I'm showing above are different ideologies. So you have the Green Party, that would be where I fit into, and I guess that kind of makes sense that I'm all the way on the left here. We've got the Democrat logo, the Republican logo, and I've included the Libertarian logo because that's the party that the Koch brothers would associate with. Well, actually, Gary Johnson's for a carbon fee. So what I'm really just pointing out is that extremism in any ideology is usually a bad thing. And I can kind of trace my own path through this chart. Everyone's born disengaged, of course. Since I'm a Green, I've probably always been cautious about this issue. And there would be certain events in my life, like seeing an inconvenient truth, that would cause me to become concerned, and other events, which I'll talk about later, that would cause me to become alarmed. So one piece of good news, I think, for me, is that the level of concern right now is almost back to where it was in 2008. They've been tracking this data for several years now. But I am also concerned for why people would think that. We did have a very hot winter this past year. We had an El Nino. There's also a 50% chance we could have a La Nina this coming winter, which would cause us to have a colder than usual winter. And if those same people that are just experiencing weather and basing their beliefs on that, they might forget all about their concern. Okay, so I think now's a good time to briefly describe my philosophy on ideology. So on any issue, we need to be able to identify where the ideological divide is. The problem is with climate change that I'm not really sure where the ideological divide is. I don't really think it's an ideological issue. I think it's a scientific issue. But as I'm finding out that scientific issues can actually be ideological issues too. So when we can find that, we can either agree to disagree or find common ground, which is hard to do if you don't know where the divide is. Extreme ideologies, I think, should be disregarded. And then, so not accepting science, to me, sounds like a pretty extreme ideology. Of course, we also have to have mutual respect for competing ideologies. I can't, say your ideology is bad and mine is good. That isn't going to work, right? And, in my point of view, it's more important why someone thinks something than what they think. So I think there are going to be ways that we can all find a way to agree. Well, clearly I'm concerned about this, or I wouldn't be making this presentation. I always thought that a scientific issue would have a right answer. Now, it's fine if we don't agree on the best solution, but I thought that we should all be able to agree that there is a problem. The other thing I'm finding out is that I'm really in the minority for the level of concern that I have. It seems like no one else around me really shares that same level of concern. There's the people that don't believe in it, and then there's the people that are kind of apathetic towards it. And it's kind of hard for me to assimilate this into my worldview that, why am I the one that's so different from everybody else? This is, some say, the largest problem man's ever faced, and no one seems to care. Maybe that's why it's the largest problem man's ever faced. The position that I have is that of just taking the side with the majority of climate scientists. This, to me, doesn't seem like such a radical position. I mean, I can't really be wrong on this one. If the climate scientists agree that they were wrong, and I just keep on going with, okay, well, I'm going to follow you, then I was never wrong. I was just choosing to be part of that consensus. And one of the other ways this really affects me is that I don't want to be part of the problem. I want to be part of the solution. If I can't be that, then how can I really even give meaning to my life? So I really need to understand what's going on here. Well, actually, getting to the bottom of this has proved quite challenging. So I kind of started off just poking and prodding on social media to see if I can gain insight into other opinions. And most of the time, I really didn't get any response. Just wanted to say a quick thanks to the few people that did discuss this with me. But what I really needed to do, I guess, was find this book, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. I'm kind of glad this existed. It was very difficult to get these answers on my own, and this book was exactly what I was looking for. It filled in the missing pieces and kind of gave me the glue to make a coherent story to fit my worldview. So the first piece of the puzzle is to talk about risk interpretation. So where would you rather move if you had to choose between one of these two houses? Would you rather move to the house that's next to a cell tower, or would you rather move to the house that's alongside a busy road? Well, the house that's next to the cell tower, that represents an unknown risk. So cell towers haven't been shown to cause cancer, but at the same time, we can't completely rule it out. The house that's alongside the busy street, however, with all these cars going by, we do know that there's carcinogens in the car exhaust. But the difference is that this is a known risk, so we're familiar with cars. And in the case of climate change, so we're familiar with burning fossil fuels. We've been doing it for our entire generation, even a little longer. And we're also familiar with the consequences of climate change, extreme weather events. So we've had hurricanes, we've had floods, we've had forest fires, we've had heat waves. These are all things that feel familiar to us. And since they're familiar to us, they don't feel threatening to us. So there's another dimension to risk. So let me ask the question, what are you more afraid of? The guy with the gun or the junk food? So I think most of us would probably think that the guy with the gun is more threatening than the junk food. And the guy with the gun represents dread risk. So dread risk is something, it doesn't necessarily have to have a high probability of occurring. It could have a low probability of occurring, but it will definitely have a large impact. And the junk food is more of a gradual risk. We know that eating junk food our whole lives is not going to be good for us. It's going to cause health problems down the road, but it always seems like it's in the distant future. So climate change definitely has dread risk associated with it. There's a lot of things that could happen that seem very scary. The problem is when people feel like they might be responsible for it, that triggers certain maladaptations, such as denial, uncertainty, playing down the threat. Anger towards the communicator is a very big one. Whenever we see somebody who's talking about climate change and they go fly in an airplane somewhere, we want to accuse them of being a hypocrite. And also we get desensitized to the idea that the climate's changing and bad things are going to happen. So I'm really arguing that climate change should be more like the junk food. We should be afraid of the junk food. All right, let's continue to discuss how our risk perception can change depending on how the threat is framed. So I found this image on the internet. I think this is from a gun website that's trying to make the argument that we should be more afraid of obesity than firearm deaths. And I'm going to continue their point. So the psychologist Dan Gilbert coined the term pain for personal, abrupt, immoral, and now. And this is what really shapes our risk perception. So from the case of the junk food example, for personal, there's really no clear enemy. It's just junk food. It's not abrupt, so your health deteriorates slowly, and we don't really perceive that to be much of a threat. It can't really be immoral. We don't have feelings of disgust over it. And now, so it feels like a future problem. It doesn't feel like it's happening now. But if you had a heart attack from eating junk food your whole life, you might see things differently. So it is personal. You might redirect the blame somewhere. You might say, hey, there should really be more warning labels on the foods I eat about how bad they are for you. And it does feel abrupt to you now because you've had a near-death experience, so it feels like it could happen again at any time. I suppose it's not possible for that person to do a 180 and feel like their body is sacred, and so now putting junk food into it is going to feel immoral. And, of course, it feels very soon. It could happen at any time. So here's an experiment created by the psychologist Daniel Kahneman regarding how we weigh risks. So suppose you get $900. You can take a chance at increasing it to $1,000 with a 90% probability, or you could take a 10% chance and lose it all. So what do? Well, I know what I would do. I would just keep the $900. I don't want a chance losing all $900. And now consider this. Suppose we did the same thing in reverse. So now the situation is you owe $900. You can choose to take a chance at owing nothing with a 10% probability, or owing $1,000 with a 90% probability. So what do? Well, if you're me, you take a chance and try to owe nothing. So what does this tell us about how sensitive we are to gains and losses? So humans are much more sensitive to losses than gains, especially in the short term. So in the first situation, I didn't want to lose $900. That's the loss. And in the second situation, I'm really only losing an additional $100. This also relates to climate change. So the Stern report from 2006 concluded that to fix climate change, if we did this back in 2006, that it would cost us about 1% of total GDP to fix. And so that's a loss. People didn't want to deal with that loss. They just kind of hoped for the best. GDP continued to grow because our accounting system's inherently flawed. But the problem really is, in the long term, it's going to cost us between 5 and 20%. Here's another experiment created by the behavioral economics professor Richard Thaler. So, how much would you pay to get a vaccination for a disease that 1 in 1,000 people will die from? So, on average, he's found that people would pay about $200. And then consider this. Would you accept $10,000 to be infected with the disease as part of a study and assume the same 1 in 1,000 odds of dying? So, if you're like me, you probably would not accept that. People are much less willing to accept the consequences if they have a choice. I mean, can you even imagine what it would be like to be one of the unlucky people that dies from this disease after you've volunteered to be infected with it? You have no one to blame but yourself. And so that brings up an important point. The framing around climate change, whether or not we think it's a choice, is very important. So President Obama says, we're the first generation to feel its effects and the last generation to be able to do something about it. On the other side, we have Carly Fiorina saying, there's no point in killing our economy since we can't do anything about it anyway. Well, I think that killing our economy is sort of a fallacy, but either way, she's presenting it as not having a choice. Lastly, I want to compare risk and worry. But before I can describe the difference, I need to explain the rational and emotional brain. So the moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt has a pretty good metaphor for this, and that's that of the elephant and the rider. So the elephant represents the emotional brain, the rider represents the rational brain. The emotional brain has a lot more influence than the rational brain, that's why the elephant is much bigger. The rider thinks he's in control, he's holding the rope on the elephant, but usually it's the elephant that gets the final say. So the elephant's in charge of our judgments. When we hear new information, the elephant gets to process it first and then passes it along to the rider for a rationalization. And This is also kind of why first impressions are important, right? You form a judgment of somebody, and if you made a bad first impression, it's really hard to overcome that because there's always that bias that the elephant stores. And pertaining to climate change, this is why I'm not really the best spokesperson for this. I'm an outsider to the group that I'm hoping to convince. So when I speak to people, their elephants are going to be biased against me, and it's going to be very difficult for me to convince them of anything. This is why facts alone don't work once a bias has been formed. 10 years ago, new information about global warming would have helped convince people. Now, if you try to convince somebody of global warming, they've already have these biases that says it's not happening. It's just going to enforce their existing worldview. So I can't convince others directly, but I can recommend sources that speak to their values. Alright, so when we talk about risk, we're really talking about the rational part of the brain, and when we talk about worry, we're talking about the emotional part of the brain. Now there's also a finite pool of worry. We can't worry about everything at once. You might have noticed this if you watch the news. Whatever the story is that is the most upsetting of the day, something else upsetting happens the next day and you kind of forget all about it. So I can kind of trace my level of concern for climate change in terms of worry. 2005, if you remember, it was a pretty hot winter. I think I read an article about how polar bears were drowning, and this wasn't something that usually happens. And so I became worried, and this was probably the first time I became alarmed about climate change. It didn't stick though, right? I wasn't alarmed since 2005. I was temporarily alarmed at that point. Again, there was an event that I remember in 2009. This was the first time I had heard that climate change is going to happen and we're not going to be able to stop it completely. I remember reading something about how the Navy wanted to try to operate in the Arctic after the ice melted. This was kind of a shock to me at the time because I thought we were going to stop this before this happened. And now all of a sudden we're talking about, oh yeah, it's happening. We're going to, have to go patrol up there in the Arctic. So then again, the alarmism came back temporarily. It didn't really stick again. And then several more years went by. And finally I found something that made it stick. Actually, the real reason that this stuck was because this motivated me to keep reading about it. And as I kept reading more and more articles, this is what kept it constantly in my pool of worry. I read an article by Bill McKibben in Rolling Stone. This was called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math. And since I'm an engineer and I like numbers, this is probably the type of thing that speaks to me. So he presented 3 numbers. 2 degrees Celsius, that's sort of the goal that we're trying to limit global warming to, and it's becoming more and more difficult to reach that goal as we let time go by. In order to achieve this goal, we can only burn 565 gigatons more of carbon dioxide. And if you look at the next number, that's 2,795 gigatons, that's the amount of carbon dioxide in the known fossil fuel reserves. So if we burn it all, we're going to go way over 2 degrees. We're not going to reach the goal. And this is definitely a problem for me. So then I kind of asked myself, how come it took me so long? I'm a green. I always accepted that this is probably happening. So why was it not until 2012 when I was 31 years old that I really came to realize just how serious this problem is? This is not a problem that's going to affect me later in life. This is happening now. We're really, the window that we have to stop this before it gets out of control is really shrinking. And I thought about it for a long time. This took me over a couple of years to really figure out why I didn't see it earlier. And it was because nobody else around me was talking about it. It wasn't on the news. None of my friends were talking about it. There was a complete lack of social cues. It wasn't until that I did the reading on my own, did the research on my own, that I really understood how serious of a problem this is. And lack of social proof is just not a good reason to not feel that there's a serious problem going on. Even worse, there's people that are totally convinced that there is no problem, that this is all natural, or whatever their reason is. And so that would be even harder to overcome. Not just is there not social proof or social cues, there's social proof showing that climate change isn't real. But again, this isn't a scientific argument. This is a sort of a social response. So I really encourage people to kind of look into this on their own. Don't necessarily take my word for everything, but Looking around you at what other people are doing is not the best way to understand what's going on with climate change. So to recap what I just talked about, this is why climate change doesn't really feel threatening. So there's familiar causes, cars, for example, for burning fossil fuels, and the consequences are also familiar. Of course, not in a statistical sense, but we're all somewhat familiar with extreme weather events. There's really no clear enemy. The problem's pretty distributed amongst people, and it's gradual on a human timescale, not on a geological timescale. And it doesn't feel immoral either. There's no feelings of disgust associated with it, and we perceive it as a future problem. Of course, there's also a 40-year lag associated with the Earth system because of thermal inertia of the oceans, but that's not something that we easily observe. Of course, to an environmentalist, things feel very different. So we think that there's going to be many catastrophic consequences. There's going to be physical consequences such as heat waves, sea level rise, ocean acidification. There's going to be economic consequences. The hurricanes and the sea level rise, that's going to have a huge economic toll. There's going to be societal consequences. There's evidence that the drought in Syria contributed to the rise of ISIS. And there's another recent report published in the National Academy of Sciences on climate stress and armed conflict. That's the one by Carl Friedrich Schleusner. And if you have countries with ethnic diversity and there's climate stress, you result in armed conflict, I think 23% of the time. There's also ecological consequences. Coral bleaching. A large fraction of species are facing extinction right now. So we also have a clear enemy, the fossil fuel companies, right? I mean, I just talked about how much fossil fuel reserves we have and how much is safe to burn, and they feel that we're giving them permission to burn it. And climate change is abrupt if you think about it on a geological timescale. This is happening very quickly, and species aren't going to be able to keep up and adapt at this rate. So, even if you say the climate's changed before, in the past, the few times it has changed this fast before, it's really the rate of change that's important. There's been mass extinction. And so, yeah, this is definitely immoral. I'm going to talk about this next, but climate change sets off moral triggers on all 6 of the moral foundations from Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. And this is not, happening in the future for environmentalists. This is happening in the past, the present, and the future. If you look at the top right figure, this is the well-known Keeling Curve, carbon dioxide concentrations over time. And the green line is the scientifically agreed upon safe level. That's 350. You might have heard of the organization 350.org, and that's what the name comes from, the concentration of 350 parts per million carbon dioxide. Well, we passed that in the 90s. So right now, we're above 400 parts per million, and if we're going to meet the goal at Paris to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's that red line up at the top, we're going to hit that pretty soon. So yeah, in climate change, it feels like my future security is being kind of ripped away from me now. So that's a way to frame it so that it's in the present. I want to be able to retire one day. I don't want things to devolve to the point where there's armed conflict all around the world. So the way most people would think of extreme weather is, we've always had extreme weather, but if you really look at it in the bottom figure, this is a shift in the distribution. So most people aren't going to think statistically like that. But what this really says that you get these extreme events much more often, and this definitely has economic implications. If we have a lot more heat waves, then there's going to be a lot more deaths related to the heat waves. There's going to be a lot more forest fires. That's what we're seeing now. You can say the same thing about flooding, and when that distribution shifts, properties are going to flood more. Same with sea level rise. If properties start flooding too often, that's going to really depreciate the value of those homes. If you're going to buy a house in an area where this is changing and you're getting a 30-year mortgage, you might want to know what it's going to be like 30 years from now. So let me discuss the moral perspective. So along the middle, these are the 6 foundations from Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory. And on the left column, I have environmentalists' moral values, and on the right, the argument from the non-environmentalist. So an environmentalist would say that global warming is going to harm other species, it's going to harm the poor, and eventually it's going to harm everyone. And the non-environmentalist might not care that it harms the polar bears or other species so much. but the point is it is going to harm everyone eventually. I guess the counter argument would be that it's going to harm the economy. I believe that's a false argument, though. Okay, what about fairness and cheating? So the environmentalist would say that there's negative externalities that need to be addressed. This is a market failure. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're just allowed to dump this for free without having to pay the cost of it. And the counter argument would be that we shouldn't show preference for renewables. But this is really about having a level playing field. I suppose you could make that argument if you didn't believe that carbon dioxide had any ill effects and that it wasn't actually a negative externality. That's just not the case. Okay, what about liberty oppression? So, personally, I would feel a lot more liberty if we started doing something about this. I want to use energy just like everybody else does. I don't want to have to worry about how much energy I'm using. If we could just start making clean energy, then I would have no problem using all the energy that I wanted. I think the counter argument here would be we've been doing it this way all our lives and we want to continue to do it this way. And I just don't think that's a good choice. Okay, sanctity degradation. So the Earth is being irreversibly degraded. Maybe not completely irreversibly, but at least on a human timescale. And the loss of biodiversity is something that's not recoverable. And the counter argument might be that if we do any action, it will degrade our quality of life. Again, this all depends how you frame it. I think my life would be so much better if we started doing something, and people really don't know what the solutions are yet. This has not been in the discussion. We're still talking about, is there a problem? I think if people realize that there are solutions, there's actually conservative solutions. And, they probably wouldn't feel that way if they knew about them. So, okay, loyalty and betrayal. Oil companies are betraying humanity. This is really a big deal. This is taken lightly by so many people. So there's loyalty to your political party. So if you're a Republican, the Republican platform explicitly says that they're not for the Paris Agreement, for instance. So if you're a Republican and you're loyal to your party, you're going to go along with that most likely. But it goes both ways. Is the party actually being loyal to you? Are they being truthful with you? I know of at least one person who kind of came to the realization that climate change is real, and the Republican Party in general is not saying that, and was very upset. I think the biggest one for me, authority and subversion, is usually associated more with conservatives than liberals, but I think this is really the one that upsets me the most, is that climate scientists, who I think are the authority, are being subverted. People come up with all these different rationalizations about why they don't have to accept the scientific consensus on climate change. They don't trust the scientists. There was that whole ClimateGate scandal, which turned out to be a complete fabrication. People buy it because, again, the elephant makes that judgment, and then the writer says, "Oh yeah, I can believe this," right? And so the other perspective on the authority subversion is the social group is the authority, right? If you're part of that group that doesn't accept climate change, and everyone around you says you shouldn't accept it, then you're going to go with that. So we all know that climate change is an environmental problem. But how many of us are actually aware that it isn't exclusively an environmental problem? Climate change is a very multivalent type of problem. So the first thing I wanted to learn was the science behind it. It's a scientific problem. So one of the things I did was I took an online course on MIT. I also took another course on sustainability through Coursera at the University of Illinois. Sustainability is a big part of climate change. Is it sustainable that we're putting so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? I think the answer is no. I also read a book on the effects of overpopulation. So again, this is another issue that's closely coupled. The more people there are, the more resources we use. Depending on where you live in the world, affects how much carbon dioxide you're responsible for, and so on. It's a national security problem. So there's been several reports that I've read. This one's through the National Intelligence Council. There's others that I've read through different branches of the DoD that are made publicly available. And they say climate change is a threat multiplier. So it's not exclusively a future problem, but we're starting to talk about the future. And Bill McKibben wrote a book called Earth, which is about what he thinks that the future of the Earth is going to be like with climate change, and some of the ways that we're going to have to adapt to it. Another book, this wasn't mainly about climate change. I think it was probably mentioned a couple times, but this is sort of Al Gore's vision of the future and what's driving global change. He talks a lot about the global mind and Earth Incorporated and globalization. So this is a book that isn't so much on the problem as it was on the solution, but it points out that agriculture could go either way. Our current system of agriculture is part of the problem. This book tries to present another form of agriculture which could be part of the solution. Definitely an economic problem. The consequences of climate change are going to have economic costs. And also the solutions of climate change can have economic benefits. So this is probably the first book I read after getting serious about wanting to be part of the solution on climate change. And I really don't think a lot of people know what a carbon tax is all about. So, and unless you're a tax policy wonk, it's a little bit hard to get through. It's probably well worth the read. It's also a political problem, right? So we have people like the Koch brothers who are on the side of not wanting to do much about climate change. I'm not actually sure what their current stance is, whether they believe in it or not, but at least they didn't believe in it before. So they've been trying to influence elections. They've been spreading all sorts of misinformation, misinformation that contradicts itself, whatever sticks for certain people. At the same time, they've been funding election campaigns, trying to get people who will not take any action on climate change elected. It's also a social justice issue. So this was a good book that I read by Wen Stevenson. So climate change is going to affect the poor first, and it's already doing that. And not just climate change, just even the pollution. There's communities that live in these really polluted areas, and it's definitely a social justice issue. So along those same lines, it's a moral issue. The Pope came out with his encyclical, Laudato Si, about a year ago, and it's about the environment, but it's really about taking care of the poor and how climate change is really going to affect the poor. And I think this is really the big one, and people definitely don't know about this. You can tell from the comments section on social media, it's a communications issue. Even if you think you're right on something, it's not good to be self-righteous. It's very important to be respectful. And if you can't understand the other side, I had no clue how people could not accept this. It's frustrating. And so climate change is not just an environmental problem, it's really all of the above. You can really make it however you want to make it, and that's why it's a wicked problem. The solutions also affect the problem definition. If we say, the clean power plan, this is the solution to climate change, well, that has other drawbacks to it. Well, that's the government interfering and telling people what to do. And so a lot of people aren't okay with that. And then they think that the solution is worse than the problem, and the problem changes. So wicked problems are really difficult to deal with.
So because climate change is such a multivalent problem, words and frames are going to be very important for describing it. So let me start out by asking the question, which term is more insulting, denier or skeptic? So the problem is that these two terms mean different things. So a denier would be somebody who already has an opinion on something and refuses to change it, regardless of the evidence. And a skeptic is someone who's still open to what the answer really is and wants to investigate further. But they have different connotations. So a denier, when you call someone a denier because they're not agreeing with you, that's actually pretty insulting, and this was Al Gore's big mistake. So what about disavower? This is probably a better term to use. This is somebody, they kind of know what's happening, but they just can't believe it. Here's another one. Which policy is preferable? A revenue-neutral carbon tax or a carbon fee and dividend? Well, most people have an adverse reaction to the word tax, so they might think that a carbon fee and dividend is better, but actually these two things mean the exact same thing. And neither one of them is actually a tax in the way we think about it. So this is a tax in which all the money is collected and returned to the people. So here's another one. How can the following quote, this is actually about Michael Mann, not from him. Let's use Mike's trick to hide the decline. So if this is taken out of context, you might think that Michael Mann is trying to trick somebody by hiding some of the data. This isn't the case. What he's really talking about is a trick to incorporate tree ring data, project those into temperatures. Okay, another one, the words uncertain and unsure. They're not the same thing, but when scientists talk about uncertainty, the public thinks that they're unsure. Uncertain has a very strict mathematical definition.
Along these lines, William Freudenberg coined the phrase scientific certainty argumentation methods, or SCAM.
Since facts don't speak to our emotional brain, we internalize this emotional information via narratives, and the words and frames we use are important for constructing the narratives. So here's a few. The evangelical environmental network says taking action on climate change is the moral equivalent of protecting unborn life. Rob Sisson from Conserve America, climate change is the greatest single infringement on liberty after abortion. 600,000 American babies are poisoned while still in their mother's womb every year by toxins released from burning fossil fuels. So think about that. This is basically saying that doing what we're doing now is equivalent to abortion. And I think the main difference is there's not really intent, but does a drunk driver have intent to hurt someone? Okay, another way to motivate people is talk about geoengineering. So environmentalists didn't want to talk about geoengineering because they don't want people to use it as a crutch. There's a lot of other problems that would be associated with doing it. But this motivates a lot of conservatives. They want to fix the problem with technology. And there's certainly some truth to that. We might be able to utilize technology to help solve this problem. I don't think it's going to be the only way we can do it. It's going to be more of a multifaceted approach. But hey, let's talk about it if it gets people engaged. And here's one that I really like. There's no need to make personal sacrifices. Our demand for energy doesn't give fossil fuel companies permission to pollute for free. We need to leave it's not safe to burn in the ground. So what this is saying is, it's not our fault. We're born into this society. Not everybody has the luxury of being able to not burn fossil fuels. And so this is just something we have to accept. It's not our fault. So if we frame the problem as though it's the fault of the fossil fuel company instead of us, then we don't feel like we have a choice in the matter, and that will help us with our maladaptations. Okay, another one. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. So this attempts to take the problem, which is typically framed in the future, and frame it in the present. Here's a quote by Frank Luntz. A compelling story, even if factually inaccurate, can be more emotionally compelling than a dry recitation of the truth. This is certainly true, and it's partly responsible for the situation we're in today. So there's a pretty big elephant in the room that no one's talking about. When narratives gain popularity, you end up with a social norm. Social proof has been given to denial of climate change. So 2 terms from psychology that I read about are pluralistic ignorance and conditional cooperation. And I actually like these terms. They're pretty descriptive in describing what's going on. So a pluralistic ignorance, that's a situation in which the majority of group members privately reject the norm but incorrectly assume that most others accept it and therefore go along with it. So when it comes to climate change, there's definitely a fair amount of pluralistic ignorance. When people ask for surveys, if people have a concern over global warming, there's a large percentage some of the time that say yes. But if you ask people a different question, rank the top 5 things that are most important to you, climate change won't make that list.
Rotate the slide to make it fit. But if you remember back to the 6 Americas slide, 70% of Americans believe in global warming, 18% think it's a hoax, and 12% are disengaged. So here's some more data from the Yale Project on Climate Change Communications. This table shows that even though most people believe in it, it's very low on most people's priority list. So you can really see why people would have a sense of pluralistic ignorance.
It's also why when I talk about this on social media, I barely get any responses. Some social scientists say if as little as 10% of the population became concerned and talked about this, that we could have action. And this kind of goes along with conditional cooperation, a situation that people will act only once others have taken action first. So this is kind of how I frame the problem. If we can get people to start talking about this, then that would go a long way. It would change the social norm, essentially. We know about these principles from other experiments that have been done. One is the smoke-filled room. So if someone's sitting alone in a room and smoke starts coming in, there's a pretty good chance that they're going to get up and walk out of the room or tell somebody what's going on. However, if they're in a room with other people and they observe that no one else is reacting to the smoke, they're a lot more likely to stay there. So for climate change, our world is filling up with carbon dioxide, and there's a large group of people that are indifferent to it because of the social reactions of everyone around them. And this pluralistic ignorance concept means that people don't talk about it. So there's actually a socially constructed silence around climate change. And because no one's talking about it, everyone arrives at their conclusion via a different approach. But the ends don't justify the means. This is actually one of the most frustrating things to a climate activist. So I think this Ladder of Dissent analogy comes from Michael Mann. Basically the analogy is that the level of disavowal of climate change is like a ladder. So there's people at the bottom who have very unsophisticated... There's people at the... There's people at the bottom of the ladder who have very unsophisticated responses for why they choose to accept this social norm. And then as you climb up the ladder, you get more and more sophisticated responses. So what I hope to do is show that there are, even if you don't want to be on my side with this, that you can climb the ladder and we can actually have an intelligent conversation about this. But if you're down at the bottom of the ladder, we can't even do that. So there are people, despite just looking at the graph of the Keeling Curve, that would deny that CO2 levels are actually increasing, which is very odd. I've heard they exist. I don't know any, but I don't think anyway. And then when they had the resolutions for the Keystone XL pipeline, there were votes in the Senate, and it turns out that one of the 100 senators actually voted that climate change is not happening at all. This was agnostic to whether or not man is causing it. That's Senator Roger Wicker from, I believe, Mississippi. And then there was a vote on whether or not man is causing it, and all of the Republican senators, except for 5 of them, voted that that was happening. So there are 5 Republican senators that are more or less on my team. Some of the more scientifically minded people might decide to cherry pick their scientists and find one that agrees with the way they see things. The retired atmospheric scientist from MIT, Richard Lindzen, had a theory about how the climate is not very sensitive to carbon dioxide, and there would be all sorts of negative feedback mechanisms from the clouds. I really don't have a problem with him saying this, because I think it's actually healthy for science to have people that kind of go against the grain. But for people to cherry pick who they want to listen to is a different story altogether. The most convincing thing I've heard from a climate change skeptic, and this guy is actually a skeptic in the true definition of the word, is the physics professor from University of California, Berkley, Richard Muller. He actually took it upon himself to recreate a climate model because he was skeptical. He got a lot of funding from the fossil fuel industry to do this, and he was hoping to show that the climate models are wrong. But what he actually found was that, indeed, it was CO2 that's causing the warming. It is man, and he reaffirmed what the climate scientists have been telling us for about 20 years already. He disagrees with the amount of alarmism in the rest of the scientific community, and I disagree with him on this point, but if we can climb up the ladder to his point, then we can start to have serious conversations about how to fix the problem. So just very briefly, this is a picture of Richard Muller, and this is his climate model, Berkeley Earth. If you haven't heard of him before, I encourage you to look him up and check it out. If you're insisting on being skeptical about climate change, this is where you should be. But I think we can actually do one better than that, too. So, does anyone recognize any of these faces? Oops. Oh. So this is a list of prominent Republicans that are what I consider to be on my side. And I'm not one of them, so there I go. So all of these people in some way or another have said that they're for either investigating climate change or endorse specific policies to address the issue.
Here's a recent addendum. Just last week, 33 House Republicans voted against an appropriations bill that would eliminate funding for the Air, Climate, and Energy Research Program under the EPA. So we're starting to see conditional cooperation in action. So I could probably generate a whole new slide with some more faces.
And just for reference, here's their names in case anyone feels like looking them up. They might be triggering the loyalty betrayal, where they might be betraying their party. I say this actually gives them more credibility to stand up for what they believe in. I think that one of the main problems is that whenever somebody brings up the topic of climate change, people tend to assume that they want personal action. This is the way that this issue has been framed, but hopefully by now you've seen that it can be framed in other ways too. Let me tell you some of my own story about when I first got involved. Dealing with an alarmist that doesn't have solutions is pretty annoying. I was trying very hard to motivate personal action. This is what I thought had to be done. It didn't really work very well. So I wanted to set an example, so I biked 15 and a half miles each way to and from work. Figured, okay, other people live like 6 miles away. If I can do it, they can do it too. But
it was pretty much just me. There were a couple other people that rode occasionally, but I'm not sure how much influence I had on them.
So I thought, okay, maybe this is asking too much. What about something simple like turning out the lights? And that's a great way to get people really mad at you, as I found out. So I turn off the lights, and they come back in, and they have to turn them on, and it's a constant on and off, and it's not a good way to get people to join your cause. Well, then when I realized it was a political problem, I thought, oh, well, they don't have to do anything. They don't have to bike to work. They don't have to turn off the lights, and all they have to do is vote for people who aren't going to be against destroying the environment. But there's pretty strong correlation between that and one major political party. So, having people vote against their party is asking way too much again. So I think the message really is that no one wants to be told what to do, or told they're wrong, or told they're at fault. So responsibility leads to blame, which leads to resentment, which leads to defiance. And that's why if I try to get people to turn off the lights, they're just going to turn them on more. Why do people think that individual action is the way to go? Well, this is the way it's been framed, and this is kind of where An Inconvenient Truth got it wrong. So it was a really great documentary. It really showed how the problem was no longer in the future. But at the very end, the recommendations were individual action, like get energy efficient light bulbs. And so I think that was probably the best we knew back in 2006, but today we know better. And there's a big difference between collective action and individual action. So individual action does have one benefit in terms of human behavior. People are more likely to listen to somebody who practices what they preach. So, for instance, if I know that my individual action doesn't really do anything in terms of solving the problem, except that maybe people will listen to me because I do it. But collective action is really what we need. So, in addition to all the political ideologies, there's actually one more group of people that tend to be concerned about climate change, and that's the scientists. And actually, this is hot off the press. Dan Kahan at Yale recently published a paper about how the scientifically curious were a group of people who are able to go across political boundaries and accept the science. So he was able to measure this. These are the people who typically would watch a PBS special on some sort of scientific topic. So I feel like I also relate to this group. And the way that you're going to get me to change my mind about this is to change the mind of the consensus of scientists. So a lot of people don't think this is a very serious problem, but every scientific institution in the world says that this is very serious. So I had already talked about why this is really important to me, but it's not just me. There's people that are exposed to this information on a regular basis deal with a great amount of anxiety over this. So there's a very strong correlation between in-depth knowledge and you might even call it depression. So here's a few quotes. Jason Box, one of the researchers who's studying methane release from the oceans, said, even if a small fraction of the Arctic carbon were released to the atmosphere, we're effed. So he got a little bit of criticism for saying that because he's a scientist and he's supposed to remain rational and not get all emotional. So I read in the book What We're Fighting For Now Is Each Other that climate activist Ken Ward, back in 2005, was diagnosed with bipolar mania and prescribed lithium. He basically went into a psychiatrist's office and said, there's this huge problem, no one's paying attention to me, the experts, there's only a couple of experts, and I disagree with them. So, back in 2005 must have been a really bad time to go against the social norms. We've learned a lot in the last decade about how to motivate people, and this is a whole field in psychology. And the climate scientists realize that if we go past 4 degrees, which is looking like we might, that civilization might not be able to handle that. And it's just really difficult to live with the realization that people just don't care. So to me, this isn't just a hobby. This is more of a moral obligation.
So in conclusion, why is climate change a partisan issue? So let me recap the reasons I've given throughout this talk. And it's framed in a way that speaks only to environmentalists. So people think this is some sort of environmental fringe issue, and I hope I've convinced you that climate change is a multivalent problem, and we can frame it in whatever way works for us. The next reason is that personal responsibility, when combined with dread risk, leads to denial. So we shouldn't feel that we're personally responsible just because we live in a society that's dependent on fossil fuels. Again, this is how we frame it. This is not our choice. This is something that we have to deal with. Both the causes and the consequences of climate change don't make us worry because they're familiar to us. And probably the biggest reasons are that challenging the scientific consensus has been given social proof in some conservative circles, and there's a socially constructed silence even around talking about climate change. So in this case, our social instincts are actually hurting us. So how do we fix the problem? Well, there's not just one way, so a lot of times even the experts will disagree. If we knew how to fix it, we'd have fixed it by now. First, we need to educate people on how this problem can be framed in so many different ways. And it's going to be a personalized approach for each person. So depending on what their worldview is, they're going to have a different way of framing climate change. And if those people would talk about it with people that are like them, then we can help change the social norm. So remember what I said about pluralistic ignorance and conditional cooperation. Most of the people already agree that climate change is happening and caused by humans. They're just unaware that everyone else thinks that too. And there's a positive feedback mechanism that once a certain number of people join in the discussion, more and more will want to join because they don't want to be the first ones. We also can't tell people what to do. And just as there's disavowal of climate change from a lot of conservatives, there's also disavowal of the human behavior aspect of climate change from a lot of people who are concerned about climate change. If they say something insulting, it's probably safe to assume that they don't know most of the stuff that I've talked about here. And my belief is that not everything needs to be a partisan issue. There are certain things that everyone should just agree on. If you find yourself on the other side, it's probably just because you haven't found the right frame for climate change yet. Or you might just be a very social person.
There's a couple other resources I found on the internet that discuss the same book. Don't even think about it. Why our brains are wired to ignore climate change.
Well, I hope everyone learned something, and I appreciate any feedback, or if you want to give me social proof and share this, that would be great.